The first light of morning spilled across the hills of Oak Valley, Tennessee, touching the mist that hung low over the quiet town. The year was 1992, a time when everyone still left their doors unlocked, when Friday nights meant high school football, and when neighbors waved to each passing car whether they knew who was inside or not. Among those early risers was Grace Monroe, 26 years old, cheerful and full of energy that seemed to make the air itself brighter. She was the kind of person who always had somewhere to be, someone to help, something to laugh about. Grace worked as a local photographer, capturing weddings, school portraits, and community fairs across the valley. Her smile had become a fixture in the small town, friendly, familiar, and impossible to forget. On the morning of June 14, 1992, Grace woke before sunrise to prepare for a photography session scheduled at a nearby lakeside park. She brewed her usual cup of coffee, packed her camera gear, and stepped out into the warm summer air. A neighbor, Mrs. Givens, saw her loading equipment into her blue hatchback and waved from across the street. Grace waved back, calling out that she'd be home by lunch. But she never came home. By that evening, the town of Oak Valley began to stir with unease. Grace's mother, Helen Monroe, called her repeatedly, leaving messages that grew more anxious with each passing hour. When the police were finally alerted, officers found her car parked by the entrance to Lake Henley Park, its driver's side door unlocked. Her camera bag sat in the front seat, untouched. Inside the bag was a roll of undeveloped film, the last photos Grace ever took. Those photographs would become some of the most haunting pieces of evidence in Oak Valley's history. They showed the lake glimmering in the sun, families picnicking by the shore, and the faint outline of a figure standing near the tree line in the background, blurred and distant, but present. The next morning, volunteers combed the surrounding woods, calling her name through the thick summer air. For 2 days, they searched along the shoreline and through every trail that wound behind the park. When they found nothing, the community's hope dimmed, though no one said it aloud. On the 4th day, a search team discovered a torn piece of fabric tangled in brush near a narrow creek that ran behind the lake. The material matched the color of the dress Grace had been wearing that day, pale yellow with small white flowers. It was carefully collected and sent to the state lab for testing, though technology then couldn't determine much from it. The weeks that followed blurred into one another. Flyers with Grace's photograph appeared in every shop window. Candlelight gatherings filled the church courtyard each Sunday night. Her name was spoken in every prayer, every classroom, every whispered conversation at the diner counter. Helen Monroe, exhausted but steadfast, sat at her kitchen table each evening with the phone beside her and the porch light left on. She told anyone who visited, "She's still out there somewhere. I just need her to come home." Detective Daniel Crow, a veteran of the Oak Valley Police Department, led the investigation. He had worked dozens of cases in his 20-year career, but nothing affected him quite like this one. There was something about Grace, he later recalled. You felt like you knew her even if you didn't. The whole town felt that way. Detective Crow followed every lead that came in: sightings, tips, rumors, but each one dissolved into nothing. Without a body or solid evidence, the case grew still. The last official report in 1993 labeled it as an open missing person investigation. After that, the file sat in the archives, gathering dust as years quietly passed. By the time 2000 arrived, Oak Valley had changed. New families moved in, businesses opened, and children who had once searched for Grace were now grown with families of their own. The story of her disappearance became something spoken about rarely, a memory tucked into the town's quieter corners. Yet for Helen Monroe, time didn't soften anything. She still kept Grace's room as it was in 1992. The neatly folded quilt, the stack of photo albums, the faint scent of lilac perfume. Each birthday, she placed fresh flowers by the window and whispered, "Still waiting, sweetheart." In 2018, the state launched a new initiative to review unsolved cases using modern forensic methods. The program, led by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, began scanning old files for physical evidence that could benefit from DNA reanalysis. Detective Crow, now retired but still living in Oak Valley, received a call that made his heart skip a beat. The Monroe case was being reopened. Evidence from 1992, including the fabric fragment and a hair strand found near the creek, had been preserved in sealed containers. The lab would now apply advanced DNA testing to see if they could extract a profile that earlier technology couldn't detect. Crow visited the station that week, standing in front of the familiar case file. Its edges were frayed, but Grace's photo still looked just as it had the first day he saw it, her eyes bright, her smile soft and unguarded. He placed his hand on the folder and whispered, "Let's try again, Grace." For months, the forensic team worked quietly, carefully reconstructing the DNA profile. When results finally arrived, a faint match appeared in the database, a partial profile that aligned with a man named Robert Lane, who had once lived in Oak Valley and worked maintenance at a nearby campground in the early 1990s. At the time of Grace's disappearance, Lane had been questioned briefly but released due to lack of evidence. There was no reason to suspect him further then, until now. Detectives began piecing together his movements. They found that Lane left Oak Valley just weeks after Grace vanished and had relocated to Kentucky. He lived an ordinary life there, working small jobs, blending into the background. But now, after 26 years, his past had quietly returned to find him. When the call came that the DNA on the fabric matched Lane's profile with a probability too high to ignore, Detective Crow felt his breath catch. All those years, all those unanswered questions. The truth was finally stirring. And Oak Valley, the town that had learned to live with silence, was about to wake again. When the DNA confirmation came through, the report was quiet and clinical, a string of numbers, percentages, and technical notes. But to Detective Daniel Crow, now 70 and long retired, it felt like thunder. He received the call on a mild April morning in 2018. The wind outside carried the smell of magnolia from his garden, and birds chirped across the power lines that ran above his porch. He was pouring coffee when his phone rang. "This is Agent Maria Holt from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation," said a clear voice. "Mr. Crow, we believe we have a development in the Grace Monroe case." For a long moment he didn't say a word. His grip tightened around the phone. "A development?" he finally asked. "Yes, sir. DNA analysis from the fabric fragment has returned a confirmed match to a subject named Robert Lane. The probability of error is less than 1 in a billion." Crow closed his eyes. His mind drifted instantly back to that humid summer of 1992, to the creek, to the empty car, to Helen Monroe's trembling hands as she clutched a photograph of her daughter. "I remember him," Crow said quietly. "Lane worked maintenance out at Henley Campgrounds. We interviewed him once." "Yes, sir," Agent Holt replied. "We saw that in your notes. He left town 2 weeks after the disappearance. We're rechecking his background now." Crow set down his coffee cup. "If you're reopening it, I want in," he said. The line went silent for a moment before Holt answered. "We'd be honored to have you consult, Detective." And just like that, the case that had defined his early years returned to his life. pulling him back into the same rhythm of observation and instinct he thought he had left behind. That week, Crow drove to the state crime lab in Nashville to meet the new investigative team. He arrived wearing a pressed shirt and carrying his old notebook, the same one he'd used decades ago, its pages filled with handwritten notes in fading ink. When he entered the briefing room, the evidence box sat in the center of the table. The seal had been carefully opened, its contents neatly labeled. Crow looked at the pale yellow fabric fragment, still sealed in its plastic pouch. It was smaller than he remembered, fragile, like something that had survived fire and time both. Agent Holt walked him through the findings. "The DNA extracted from this cloth is male," she explained. "We compared it to all profiles in the federal database. Robert Lane's record was added in 2014 for a minor offense in Kentucky. That's how the match was made." Crow nodded slowly. "That's him. He was 28 in '92, lived alone in a trailer near the lake. He told me he saw Grace the morning she went missing, said she waved to him on her way into the park." "Did he seem nervous?" Holt asked. "He seemed rehearsed," Crow replied, "like he'd practiced what to say." Holt took notes. "We've located him in Lexington, still living under his real name. We'll approach him soon, but we wanted you to be briefed first." Crow studied the evidence table for a long moment before speaking again. "Don't tell Helen yet," he said softly. "Not until we're sure." For nearly 3 months, the team built a detailed profile on Lane's life since 1992. He had moved frequently, small towns across Kentucky and northern Tennessee. His jobs were ordinary: construction, janitorial work, park maintenance. Nothing about him stood out, which perhaps was how he'd stayed invisible for so long. In early July, the Bureau coordinated with Kentucky State Police to make contact. At 6:30 a.m. on July 9, 2018, officers arrived at Lane's modest house on the edge of Lexington. He was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea when they approached. "Mr. Lane?" Agent Holt asked as she stepped forward. He nodded, cautious but calm. "We're with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation," she continued. "We'd like to speak with you regarding a case from 1992 involving Grace Monroe." Lane froze. His eyes flickered the faintest shift, but his voice stayed steady. "That was a long time ago," he said. "Yes," Holt replied, "but we're looking again, and we'd appreciate your cooperation." He agreed to go with them voluntarily. Inside the interrogation room later that morning, Lane sat quietly as agents placed documents before him: photographs, maps, and the old interview notes from 1992. Crow watched from behind the observation glass, his pulse steady but his heart heavy. Lane looked older now, his hair thin and silver, but the eyes were the same. Holt began the questioning carefully. "Mr. Lane, you worked at Henley Campgrounds during the summer of 1992, correct?" He nodded. "And you remember Grace Monroe?" "Everyone did," he said simply. "You told police then that you saw her near the lake, that she waved to you?" "Yes, ma'am." "Did you ever have contact with her after that?" "No, ma'am, never did." Holt slid a photograph across the table. It showed the pale fabric fragment. "This was found near the creek behind the lake. DNA analysis links it to you." Lane blinked, then shook his head. "That's not possible," he said. "Must be a mistake." Holt leaned forward, calm but certain. "It's not a mistake, Mr. Lane, it's science." He didn't speak for nearly a minute. His hands trembled slightly as he rubbed them together. Then, in a low voice, he said, "That day, she asked for help, said her car battery died." Crow's breath caught behind the glass. Holt's eyes narrowed slightly. "And did you help her?" "I tried," he said. "We talked for a few minutes. She seemed kind. Said she'd just finished taking photos. I don't remember much else." "Did you see her leave?" Holt asked. He hesitated. "No, I walked back to my truck. She was still there." "Mr. Lane, did you ever go into the woods with her?" He looked down. "No," he whispered. "No, ma'am." When the interview ended, Lane was polite, quiet, and seemingly detached. He maintained his story, fragments of memory with gaps wide enough to drive through, but the DNA was undeniable. Within a week, an arrest warrant was issued. The day the news broke, Oak Valley fell into a hush. Television vans appeared near the courthouse, and for the first time in years, Grace Monroe's name filled the air again. Helen Monroe sat in her living room watching the coverage, her hands folded in her lap. When she saw Lane's photograph flash on the screen, her expression didn't change. She just nodded softly and said, "Thank you." Detective Crowe visited her later that evening. The sun was setting, casting soft gold across her porch. When she opened the door, she smiled faintly, as though she'd been expecting him. "They found him," he said gently. "I know," she replied. "I heard on the news. You never stopped looking, did you?" He shook his head. "I promised I wouldn't." She motioned for him to sit. On the table before them sat an old album, Grace's photographs, carefully arranged. Pictures of smiling couples, summer festivals, blooming gardens. Each image was filled with color and warmth. "She'd be happy you didn't give up," Helen said quietly. "She believed people were good even when they made mistakes. That's how she was." Crowe's eyes softened. "She made this town better, Helen. We all felt that." Outside, cicadas hummed in the evening air. In August 2018, Robert Lane was extradited to Tennessee. His trial began the following spring. Prosecutors presented a clear timeline: Lane's presence at the lake, the DNA match, and the reconstructed evidence that tied him to the scene. Though no body had ever been recovered, the court accepted forensic probability and circumstantial detail as proof beyond reasonable doubt. The defense argued for uncertainty, claiming contamination, old evidence, and unreliable memory. But the jury listened quietly as Agent Holt and forensic experts described the careful process used to preserve every artifact since 1992. When Detective Crowe took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried decades of emotion. "I carried this case my whole career," he said. "And I can tell you, even when time changes everything, truth doesn't change at all." Lane's lawyer declined to cross-examine. Helen attended every day of the trial, dressed in pale colors, always with a small photograph of Grace pinned to her blouse. On the day closing arguments ended, she placed her hands together and whispered a silent prayer, not for punishment, but for completion. The verdict came on May 6, 2019. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned to the courtroom. The judge asked if they had reached a decision. The foreperson stood, unfolded the paper, and read "guilty." The word hung in the air for a long time. Lane lowered his head. Helen closed her eyes, and Crowe, seated at the back, quietly exhaled a breath he'd been holding for 27 years. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters asked Helen how she felt. She smiled faintly and said, "Grace always believed truth finds its way. It did." That evening, the courthouse steps filled with candles, hundreds of them, placed by townspeople who remembered Grace even after all those years. Some were children in 1992, now adults with families of their own. Others were newcomers who only knew her story through whispers. Crowe stood at the edge of the crowd, watching the flickering light. He thought about that morning by the lake, the search teams, the questions that had never faded. And for the first time, he felt peace. The years after the verdict unfolded slowly for Oak Valley, like the quiet turning of pages after the last line of a heavy book. The courthouse lights dimmed, the reporters left, and the town returned to its old rhythm. But something had changed, quietly and permanently. The air carried a different stillness, one that wasn't built on silence anymore, but on understanding. Robert Lane was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The sentence hearing lasted only 20 minutes, yet for everyone in that courtroom, it felt like decades compressed into 1 hour of truth. Lane stood motionless as the judge read the ruling, his face empty of reaction. When asked if he had anything to say, he paused, then shook his head. "No, sir." The judge nodded solemnly. "This court finds justice served, though delayed." Helen Monroe was in the second row that morning. As Lane was escorted out, she didn't look at him, not once. Her gaze stayed fixed on a spot above the bench, as if Grace were watching from somewhere unseen. After the sentence, Helen quietly left through the side door, walking past reporters who respectfully gave her space. Outside, sunlight spilled over the courthouse steps, and she stood there for a long moment, head bowed, hands clasped together. Detective Daniel Crowe joined her. His hair had turned fully gray, his posture slower, but his eyes were gentle. "She'd be proud," he said softly. Helen nodded. "It's strange. I thought I'd feel anger, but I don't, just quiet." "That's peace," Crowe replied. "It's what she would have wanted for you." They stood together in silence before Helen turned to him. "You've done your part, Daniel. You gave my daughter back her name. That's more than most people ever get." Crowe smiled faintly. "It was never just a case to me. She was part of this town, part of all of us." Helen squeezed his hand gently, then walked toward her car. The moment she closed the door, tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't the sharp, burning tears of old grief. They were soft like rain washing dust from a window after a long drought. That night, Oak Valley held a memorial vigil by the lakeshore where Grace had last been seen. The entire community gathered, families, students, teachers, and old friends who hadn't spoken of that summer in years. Candles floated across the dark surface of the water, each one reflecting a name, a memory, or a small message written on paper hearts. Helen stood by the dock holding a small photograph of Grace, her daughter smiling behind a camera, sunlight spilling across her face. Beside her stood Crowe, and beside him Agent Holt, who had flown down from Nashville just to attend. A local pastor spoke softly into a microphone. "Tonight, we light these candles not only for Grace Monroe, but for every truth that hides in the dark until it's ready to be found." When the candles drifted across the lake, Helen whispered, "She loved this place." Crowe nodded, and it loved her back. The following week, Helen decided to donate Grace's old photography equipment to the Oak Valley High School art department. Her daughter had saved for years to buy that camera, and Helen wanted it to inspire others. She handed it over to the art teacher, who promised it would be used to teach students about light, patience, and perspective. The same 3 things Grace had always talked about. A small plaque was added beneath the classroom window. In memory of Grace Monroe, her eyes saw beauty where others saw ordinary. Students noticed. Some even researched Grace's story for local history projects, learning how her case had shaped the region's approach to cold investigations. By 2020, Tennessee's Bureau of Investigation had created a small cold case task force in her name, the Monroe Initiative, dedicated to preserving and re-examining unsolved cases with modern forensic tools. It was spearheaded by Agent Holt, who often said the initiative existed because one woman's truth demanded it. At the official ceremony, Holt gave a brief speech, her voice calm but heavy with emotion. Grace Monroe wasn't forgotten because people like Detective Crow and Mrs. Monroe refused to let silence win. Every file we reopen carries a piece of that same promise. Helen sat in the front row, clutching a white handkerchief embroidered with Grace's initials. Later that evening, she visited the cemetery not to cry, but to talk. Grace had no grave, but Helen had placed a memorial stone years earlier, engraved with her photograph and the words, "Forever in Bloom." She sat down beside it, brushing leaves away with her hand. "They finally know," she whispered, "and I finally know you can rest." The wind moved gently through the trees, rustling the grass in slow, soft waves. It almost sounded like a reply. Back in Oak Valley, life began to settle again, but small reminders of Grace appeared everywhere. The mural painted on the side of the general store, the scholarship fund started in her honor, the old newspaper clippings framed in the diner near the town square. People would sometimes glance at them, shake their heads, and say, "That poor girl," but then add, "They got him, though." Time softened the tragedy, turning it into memory, not sharp anymore, but steady and real. Detective Crow, now officially retired for good, spent his days fishing on the same lake that once held so many unanswered questions. He kept a small photograph of Grace in his wallet. Whenever he cast his line, he'd look across the water and feel a quiet satisfaction that the truth, no matter how late, had surfaced. Sometimes he'd see kids playing by the shore, laughing, skipping stones, unburdened by the past. And that sight, simple and bright, told him everything he needed to know about what justice truly meant. In 2021, Helen received a letter from a young woman named Lily Jennings, a college student who'd been inspired by Grace's photography to study visual arts. The letter read, "Mrs. Monroe, I never met your daughter, but I feel like I know her. Every time I pick up my camera, I think about how she saw the world. Thank you for keeping her light alive." Helen framed the letter and hung it by the kitchen window. It became her morning ritual: coffee, sunlight, and the words of someone who'd carried Grace's influence forward without ever knowing her. By 2023, Helen's health began to fade. She moved into a small care home on the outskirts of town, where the nurses all knew her story. On quiet afternoons, they'd sit with her and listen as she told them about her daughter's laughter, her love of thunderstorms, her habit of leaving notes around the house just to make people smile. One day, a nurse named Angela asked gently, "Do you ever wish things had gone differently?" Helen smiled faintly. "Of course. But then maybe Grace's story helped others. Maybe that's why it happened the way it did. I like to think some good came from it." Angela nodded. "It did, Mrs. Monroe. It really did." A few months later, Crow visited her there. He was older now, his hands shook a little as he carried flowers down the hallway. When he entered her room, Helen was sitting by the window, watching the trees sway. "Daniel," she said warmly, "you still bring flowers after all these years." He smiled. "Well, someone's got to keep the tradition alive." They talked for hours about the trial, about Grace, about how different the town looked now. Before he left, Helen reached out and held his hand. "You were her hero, you know," she said softly. Crow shook his head. "She was mine." It was the last time they saw each other. Helen passed away peacefully in her sleep a week later. The morning news mentioned it briefly. Mother of local cold case victim dies at 79. But in Oak Valley, it meant far more. At her memorial service, townspeople gathered again, just as they had when the case was solved. Crow spoke briefly at the podium, his voice rough but steady. "She carried Grace, not just in her name but in her heart. he said, "and she never stopped believing in truth. Because of her, none of us did either." After the service, the pastor read from a small note Helen had left behind, found tucked inside her Bible. "If you're reading this, I want you to know I'm with Grace now. Tell everyone not to be sad. Tell them to look for light. It's always there, even when it hides." That line would later become the inscription on the new memorial, installed by the lake. "Look for light, it's always there." The following spring, the town of Oak Valley hosted its first annual Grace Monroe Art Fair. Local photographers displayed their work, and a portion of the proceeds went to support forensic technology for unsolved cases statewide. Agent Holt attended the fair's opening. Standing beside Crow, she watched students set up booths filled with photographs of sunlight through trees, laughter frozen midair, and reflections dancing on water. "She'd like this," Holt said. Crow nodded. "She'd be right here with her camera." Later that afternoon, as the sun began to sink, Crow walked down to the dock one last time. He sat there quietly, listening to the water lap against the wood. The memories didn't ache the way they once had, they just existed, woven into the sound of the lake and the warmth of the air. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old silver keychain, the one he'd kept since the 1992 investigation. Attached to it was a small, rusted charm in the shape of a bird. Grace's mother had given it to him after the verdict, saying, "Keep it until you see her free again." Crow smiled, turned the charm in his hand, and let it drop gently into the water. The ripples spread outward in widening circles, catching the light. And somewhere between the fatting sun and the soft sound of wind in the reeds, it felt, finally, like the world had come full circle. In 2025, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation released a statement noting that, since the creation of the Monroe Initiative, 8 cold cases across the state had been successfully solved through modern DNA testing and renewed attention. The report concluded with one line that summed up everything Helen and Grace Monroe had come to represent. "Justice does not expire. It only waits quietly, patiently, until someone remembers to listen." Back in Oak Valley, near the lake where it all began, visitors still come. Some to walk, some to photograph, some to leave flowers by the memorial stone. The water remains calm now. The trees sway with the seasons. And every once in a while, when the evening light hits just right, a faint reflection shimmers on the surface, like the flicker of a camera flash from somewhere beyond. Grace Monroe's story, once buried beneath time and uncertainty, lives on not as tragedy but as testament. A reminder that truth may bend beneath the years, but it never truly breaks.